the most engaging content is the most emotionally engaging content. It's what makes you kind of happy, sad, angry, or horny, basically. And that's what gets shared. And the problem is that is awful for democracy because it kind of collapses that ability to base our democratic decision-making, how the public understands the world, on information that's anywhere near to being verified. I think that is where reform has kind of mimicked what the kind of MAGA movement has done in the US by creating this kind of big tent for conspiracy theories. And that means they may have to do 5% of people in the UK might believe in, 15-minute cities being a huge government conspiracy theories. But if you get, 30 or 40% of the people, together who believe in a set of them, you've actually got enough of a movement to start gaining power.
Welcome back to Democracy for Sale. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Eliot Higgins, who's the founder of Bellingcat, the investigative journalism collective. And one of the reasons I've brought Eliot onto the show is because I feel like now is a time when a lot of us are thinking about trust in politics, trust in institutions, how it's breaking down and why it's breaking down. And as well as doing amazing investigative journalism over the last few years, which we will talk about too, I think Eliot has been writing some of the most interesting kind of things I've been reading about this, what he calls disordered discourse, this way in which everything from climate denial to conspiracy movements are just kind of spreading and how it's feeding a kind of right-wing populist surge. And I think it's a really important conversation. It's a really important issue to try and deal with. So I kind of wanted to bring Eliot on to talk about some of this stuff, as well as his investigative work at Bellingcat, where he's done everything from, revealing the bombing around who bombed Malaysian flight M17, Syria, Russia. There's loads of stuff there as well. So, Eliot, I'm delighted to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Eliot, I want to just dive straight in, because I think we are living in a moment where we are seeing the kind of politics seems to be changing really, really quickly. We're seeing parties surge in the polls, go back in the polls. We had Labour won a massive majority almost just over a year ago. Now Reform are topping the polls. There's lots of reasons why we could look at this, but I feel like you've got some really interesting ideas about why you think this is happening, because it's not just happening in Britain, it's happening in America, it's happening across, especially the Western world. What do you think is happening? What do you think is driving some of this?
Well, I think there's several issues at play here, but for me, my kind of journey into this started with looking into the idea of where does disinformation come from? Why do people believe it? Because in my field of work, I'm often encountering conspiracy theories, both about the topics I'm investigating and myself in Bellingcat. And a few years ago, I was watching a documentary on the Flat Earth movement called Behind the Curve. And I realized the people in that documentary, the way they had organized themselves, their distrust in institutions was very similar to what I had seen over things like MH17, over chemical weapon use in Syria, Russia's involvement in the conflicts in Ukraine. They all had this kind of similar pattern. You had people with a deep distrust in institutions. They came together, they formed their own communities where they had their own processes for investigation and verifying. And I really kind of got stuck on the idea of why are they so similar? What's going on here? Also coming from a community that's often heavily involved in what you could call the kind of counter-disinformation movement, often you see, the finger pointing to foreign actors. Oh, Russia's tricking people into believing stuff that's not true. But that just didn't feel right to me. I mean, certainly there is Russian interference, Russian disinformation, but for this kind of core group, they really believe this stuff. This isn't just them being tricked. They're teaching each other. So this is where I started really piecing together, what are the elements of this? And there's great work that was done by Claire Wardle, who's a professor who investigates this kind of stuff, which broke down disordered information into misinformation. So that's false information, but it's shared by people who believe it's true. Disinformation, which is false information shared by people who know it's not true, and then malinformation. And that would be true information, but that's shared in a way that's caused to cause harm. So for me, that was kind of the starting point, because I realized it's not just about information, it's about the discourse that's created with that information. And that's why I started constructing this model that I've created.
And what it was, one of the reasons I kind of thought really to bring you on was I was at the Reform Party conference recently, and I kind of got in touch with you afterwards. And I was really struck. I was meeting people, hearing it on the stage as well, people who didn't believe in climate change. Climate change was a hoax. A lot of anti-vax. There was a fringe session on leaving the World Health Organization. A lot of kind of general conspiracy theories, I think, is a way of describing it, or conspiratorial thinking about how the world is arranged. A kind of sense of a them and an us, that there's people out there pulling the strings, and the kind of ordinary people are been left behind as a result. And in some ways, you can see where that comes from. You've got the Iraq War, the financial crisis. There is a sense in which governments have lied to us, the media has lied to us. But what I was really struck with actually was these people were all they different things that really kind of pushed their buttons. But the way they were talking was actually very similar. And often it felt like one was a gateway into another, and these things started to all coalesce around each other.
Yeah, I think what you're seeing now with populist movements across the West is, rather than it being under one particular theme, shall we say, it's more about kind of coalitions of different groups who have a kind of shared distrust of institutions, but their particular interest may be, say, anti-vax or 15-minute cities or, any of these range of conspiracy theories. But groups like Reform, like the MAGA movement, bring them together in a coalition. And that means they are, they may have 5% of people in the UK might believe in, 15-minute cities being a huge government conspiracy theories. But if you get, 30 or 40% of the people, together who believe in a set of them, you've actually got enough of a movement to start gaining power. And I think that is where Reform has kind of mimicked what the kind of MAGA movement has done in the US by creating this kind of big tent for conspiracy theories.
How much is the information ecosystem part of this too then? I was really struck, say, use an example of Reform. I met somebody who was a, quote, independent reporter who worked for InfoWars, Alex Jones's website, notorious for conspiracy theories. And Alex Jones, I think, might have been bankrupted by the Sandy Hook. He said that Sandy Hook was a hoax and had to pay a lot of money to the relatives of that terrible shooting in the States. I met a former Breitbart journalist who now just really videos from, he was at Epping at the videos of anti-asylum seeker protests in Epping, and he had 46 million views on Twitter. A lot of people were referencing things. I was really struck by this. People were referencing things I had never heard of. At one fringe session, someone said that the reforming government needed to investigate the Fabian Society. I said, the Fabians? You're the kind of crusty, kind of not, like centre left in a very kind of fluffy sort of way. And I found this video on Talk TV that Alex Phillips, a former Brexit Party MEP, had done investigating the Fabians, and it had 1.3 million views. And what struck me was that the information ecosystem has changed so much really quickly. And this is happening coterminously with this huge change in politics. And it feels like sometimes that doesn't get enough attention, or we don't really know how to deal with it.
Yeah, and this is really, I think, one of the biggest changes that we've faced. The information system our entire democracy is kind of based around has changed completely. And the role of institutions in that and the role of the public has also changed significantly. So there's a writer from the early 20th century, Walter Lippmann, who was a US journalist who wrote about how public opinion is formed in that period. And really, if you break it down, it's gatekeeping institutions, the media, the government, who filter information into the public sphere, and then the public build opinion around that. And that was really the system that dominated the 20th century, this kind of top-down gatekeep system. And what's really important there is also understanding kind of what are the fundamental functions of a democracy. If you really look at kind of the political writing of the kind of 19th and 20th century, it really comes down to, for me, three key things. The first is verification. It's the idea that information can be verified. It's done through the scientific method, editorial controls, so on and so forth. Now, I'm talking about this in terms of ideals, very aware that we very rarely reach them. The second is deliberation, that we have spaces where we can discuss that verified information, that it's pluralistic, that we can bring people in, parliaments, for example, and then accountability, that the powerful can be held to account, that when there's been these deliberations, that stuff happens as a result of that. And these are kind of the core functions of a healthy democracy. No democracy can ever really do them perfectly just by the complexity of society. But for me, it's really on a scale that we're either kind of moving towards those functions or moving away from them. And through the 20th century, those functions happened within institutions. And verification, for example, came through those top-down gatekeep systems. What's happened now is we live in a peer-to-peer, many-to-many ecosystem where we aren't just recipients of information, we're distributors of information. we are now the gatekeeper to information that we choose to share. The thing is, we aren't, as individuals, as a society, trained to verify information through these methods. You have to kind of opt in to learn how to do that. And this is where it becomes a really big problem, because social media algorithms share not what is the most truthful, but what is the most engaging. And the problem with that is usually the most engaging content is the most emotionally engaging content. It's what makes you kind of happy, sad, angry, or horny, basically. And that's what gets shared. And the problem is that is awful for democracy, because it kind of collapses that ability to base our democratic decision making, how the public understands the world, on information that's anywhere near to being verified. Also, deliberation has also been completely flattened. The news used to have a kind of rhythm to it. You get the morning paper, you'd watch the evening news, the debates could happen in Parliament, but now it's just constant streams of information. Everything, we've seen this with the Charlie Kirk story, where we've had, claims and counterclaims being made, discussion on social media that's bringing up all kinds of conspiracy theories. It just becomes completely flattened. So there's no real space for proper deliberation, and that means accountability is impossible. And my fear is the default state of society, of democracies at the moment, is moving towards this kind of collapse of those functions and almost assimilation of these functions by these disordered ecosystems.
I think it's been really interesting that, and especially so for the kind of things to say with democracy, we write a lot about money in politics, power, lobbying, influence. And what's so striking is the kind of stories that I think 10 or 15 years ago would have. So this week we've been writing a lot about lobbying between ministers, former ministers who've gone to work in the defence industry. They're lobbying for government. These are the kind of stories that I think would have they've existed for a long time, but there was a sense in which they would drop. We had recently the Boris leaks on The Guardian, which showed really in a lot of detail how Boris Johnson was using his private office and in government breaking the rules. They would have kind of fed into a media ecosystem where they would have got picked up a lot more. There was a lot more outlets. Outlets were possibly a little bit more small c Catholic in terms of taking stories from not necessarily from right and left. And then you would see a lot more deliberation and discussion going on around stories. It feels like they move so quickly now. Like the agenda, the space for it is it's gone in the blink of an eye.
Yeah, and if you can't capture the attention of the public, then you might as well not bother writing the story, because everyone's moved on to the next big thing. I mean, with the Charlie Kirk shooting, for example, that's just drawn all the attention from every possible story. That's dominating discussion on social media. So it basically kills any other story. And this is kind of also one of the other kind of risks, that it not only changes how we encounter information, but it shapes the behavior of the people producing that information, those institutions themselves. So you see more and more, especially on sites, for example, like the Mail Online or the Sun, where they're trying to churn out a large amount of content very quickly. Journalists who really spend all day going through things like GoFundMe pages and Reddit posts, looking for stories they can write up quickly and get 6 or 7 out, in the hope the algorithm is interested enough to serve it to readers. You see stories that would never have really got any coverage whatsoever. For example, there was a story recently about a woman from England who went on holiday in Turkey. She died, and during the autopsy, her heart was removed. And the family started to GoFundMe with her story, saying, we want to understand why that had happened. And that was then reported by the Mail Online and the Sun. And that got a huge amount of engagement, because it fed into basically, fair to say, I think, a degree of racism, a degree of fear about medical professionals. But really, that was a standard procedure in Turkey. But it wasn't nuanced in the story. It was just about grabbing engagement. And that created a whole kind of microcosm of people who were sharing false information about what happened. No real journalism was happening. But this is something you see time and time again, because that's what feeds the algorithm. That's what gets you the attention you need. So it shapes the behavior of institutions.
And I think that begs a really question, but this is very AI-able as well. What will AI do to this kind of disordered landscape, this sort of information ecosystem, or what are we already seeing?
Well, there's one of the big things I'm seeing at the moment is AI is basically used as an excuse to ignore real evidence. You saw, actually, Donald Trump was talking about a video of items being thrown out the back windows of the White House, which he said was, AI. That was his answer to that question. But then he later basically said the great thing about AI is you can either say something's true or not and blame it on AI either way. So it's like he's saying very clearly kind of one of my biggest fears about this. I mean, there's other issues as well. It's not just about kind of churning out content. It's also how people interact now with information. I see more and more things like Grok, for example, on X being used as a fact-checking service. And quite frequently it gets stuff wrong because it's a large language model, not an intelligent fact checker. Something else I've seen is with the kind of blurry images we've got of the suspected shooter in the Charlie Kirk case, are people using basically these AI packages to upscale them. But the problem is it doesn't work like they think it works. So you're getting like 5 or 6 different versions of different versions of the same person that are then being used to justify people's biases. And usually it's kind of, at the moment, pointing fingers at trans people as a perpetrator of the shooting. So there's various dangers to, AI. I think sometimes we think of it too much in terms of, it can churn out more false content, when actually it changes people's behaviors and the way they interact with information in different ways as well.
I think the incentive structure thing you're talking about is really interesting as well. I think we can all experience it as journalists as well. There's like, if I do X, Y is more likely to happen in terms of like audience engagement. And and you can see how that's really in a world in which media is pared back. People are moving more and more. I'm really struck the amount of people I meet who are news avoidant in terms of traditional news sources, but getting a lot of news from social media, etc. So it kind of like, back in, it's, if a 13-year-old can start, any age really can start producing content, and the incentive structure is built for you to produce content that sparks outrage. And so the more you do, in some ways, like the story of Charlie Kirk is almost a story of a modern, of how modern contemporary media operates and how contemporary influence and what that produces.
Yeah, and it in a way shapes our behavior to make us more addicted to the system. Really, social media is about extracting value from the users. And part of the way it extracts that value is figuring out how to make them stay on that service as long as possible, basically making us as addicted to the systems as possible. We're basically participants in creating the most addictive kind of digital drug possible, and making sure that the algorithm can kind of create a ghost of ourselves, a kind of phantom that matches with other phantoms that it serves content to. It doesn't create an image of a real person. It creates a kind of database of what people like, and you train it by every single interaction. It's not just posting, but looking at a post, liking it, resharing it. That's training basically an addiction system that's extracting value from you as an individual. And that is based, unfortunately, on many of our worst tendencies, our kind of basic psychological needs. And I find that extremely worrying. And you see that happening more and more, that if you look at the way people engage with information on social media, it's just stuff being fed to them that reinforces what they already believe. And that creates a kind of splintering of reality, that you can be served a set of bespoke information for people like you. And the algorithm decides that you're the kind of person who wants to see this, that kind of pulls you further and further into a completely different version of reality to, maybe the person sitting across from you from work or your neighbor.
I think it's interesting as well if you look at I think traditional journalism and traditional journalists have struggled to understand this. I think to take one example, I was talking about reform, GB News. So when GB News set up, a lot of journalists I talked to I don't understand this, it's not going to make any money. And the people who the people who now bankroll it is Paul Marshall, a hedge fund manager, a hedgie who is a evangelical Christian who's bankrolled a lot of, who bought The Spectator and has a lot of political interests, and Christopher Chandler, who's a New Zealand-born hedge funder, again, who made a lot of money in Russia and now lives in Dubai and also funds a lot of British political think tanks. They've lost loads of money. So it's not a value. As journalists, we struggle to understand it. But I'm really struck watching the content sometimes, especially talking to people who watch it, that it becomes a self-reinforcing thing. The content becomes more extreme, but also the job of the content, it leads you into other places. So I just saw as we're today, as we're recording, Neil Oliver, who's still got a show on GB News, although I think they show it online because it means it doesn't have to, it's not Ofcommable, talking about how there's going to be a false flag operation soon in London at a protest in London, at a Tommy Robinson protest. And these are really extreme positions. Like, these are not the kind of positions you would have really struggled to hear these voices before the invention of the smartphone. It's fair to say you'd have to have gone somewhere to go and get this sort of content. Whereas now you can end up watching something reasonably benign that starts you down a journey that ends up with false flag. With TV presenters telling there's going to be a false flag operation.
Yeah, and algorithms, online communities, that kind of content basically means people are being filtered towards the most extreme version of views that they can hold. So, if you think back to COVID, you could, Google, are COVID vaccines safe, for example? Now, that would give you a set of content. Some of it might be saying, yes, it's safe, but there will be a subset that says, no, it's not safe. But it could be for a number of reasons. It could be something, fairly, kind of mild compared to some of the more extreme stuff, like, having lots of vaccines at once are bad for you. That's kind of like a point of debate in the US. So you think, that's reasonable. You click on it, you get served content about that by the algorithm, encounter communities discussing it. But a subset of that will be more extremes. It's like, actually, they're designed to make you ill by Big Pharma. So you go, click on that. Some people might, some people will. And then they're now reading that Bill Gates wants to put microchips in vaccines. So you're being kind of filtered towards the most extreme version of beliefs that you can hold on any given subject. Now, not everyone goes to that point, but the deeper you distrust sources of authority on that topic, especially traditional institutional ones, the more likely you are to be drawn towards that. And what's happening is, as we have more examples of kind of political betrayals, Iraq in 2003 is a really good example of that, betrayal by the media and the perception of the public, you have more and more people drawn towards these ideas because they're thinking, I can't trust the government. I know they lie about things like this in the past. If you look at, for example, the alternative health community, a lot of them have had very bad experiences with medical professionals. But what happens is the kind of Venn diagrams of those communities start being drawn together of their shared distrust in institutions. It's been interesting for me to see that in the kind of old health community, how many of the influencers there are saying, I knew Charlie Kirk, he was a friend, I was on his podcast a lot. Other people saying how sad they were, and part of that community being like, what the hell are you talking about? And the other half going, yeah, we agree, because they don't realize that this is kind of that underlying distrust of institutions is kind of glue that brings them together, the center of gravity in those Venn diagrams.
What can be done then, I guess, is one of the questions I find myself thinking a lot as well, because what we've got is, as you've got this mass distrust of institutions. You've got verifiable things at institutional failures. We can see that, but underpinning that, what that's done is, rather than kind of galvanise, say, a reformist agenda. Like, a good example would be the water system in the UK. Water system in the UK, privatised water, it's been pretty bloody disastrous. Thames Water is a good example. It's almost the worst of contemporary capitalism, huge amounts of asset stripping, loading it with debt, etc. And the environmental agency, most people would agree, not really fit for purpose. The regulator Ofwat's, almost lots of their staff end up getting hired by the privatised regulator for better wages. So it's a perfect storm of that produces lots of, crap in the water, frankly. And what I'm really struck by is, one tendency will be to go, okay, well, how do we fix this? How do we reform this? What are the things that are needed? What are the structural fixes that are needed? But I'm really struck that I'm hearing more people going, what we need to do is get rid of all of these regulatory bodies. We need to get rid of the quangos. We need to get rid of all of this. And you're like, well, this isn't likely to improve it. That doesn't feel, that's not a logical next step that you want to improve by getting rid of everything. But that feels like it's that's the kind, it seems to be leading more and more to that sort of a politics of ripping out all the wiring.
Well, for me, I kind of was on this journey of understanding why people had lost trust and why people are drawn towards these disordered discourse, these I call disordered counterpublic. So there's this political idea in theory that a counterpublic is a community that forms reacting to some injustice that's happening within the public and institutions. You can think of it as the civil rights movement, for example, the feminist movement, the various movements through the late 19th and 20th century, for example, that people come together, they organize, and they organize around certain principles. And I used the verification, deliberation, and accountability framework to say whether or not they're functional, hollow, or simulated counterpublic. So a functional one is ones that prioritize verified information, pluralistic deliberation, and holding the powerful to account, both within and outside of the counterpublic. Hollow counterpublics really do those as a performance. that it's kind of, clicktivism. It's, the doing dance videos that get lots of engagement that really doesn't do anything. It's that kind of content that doesn't really have impact. And then you have a simulated version of that where verification is about using selected information to confirm what you already believe. That deliberation is more about testing the loyalty to the in-group and reconfirming what they already believe. And accountability is always targeted to the out-group. And if you want an easy example of that, you can look at, say, RFK Jr. and what he's up to at the moment, and basically everyone involved with the MAGA movement. The problem is there has to be spaces for those healthy, functional counterpublics to form. In my view, what's happened over the last 40 years is, thanks to kind of the rise of individualism, kind of neoliberal market logic, increased technocracy, that, the government, is giving power to the Bank of England or, wherever it may be in whatever democracy it is, the sense that politicians have become kind of middle managers to that. And also the rise in meritocracy that I think often people forget that was kind of coined as a satirical term, as something that was really bad, but that's become like the organizing logic of society. That all of these combined have really stripped out the spaces, the systems, everything that we need to actually be able to engage in that, come together and organize in a healthy way. And what's happened is the social media platforms, the algorithms have kind of replaced that. And as I've said before, creates kind of the worst incentives for people to come together and basically form these disordered counterpublics. So what we need to do is look at how to actually restore the spaces, the systems, the functions to create functional counterpublics. But that begins with, first of all, recognizing what the problem is and how it operates, and not to point fingers at Russia or people being stupid, but actually to understand all of these systems and how they interact. And I would say this is not a kind of conspiracy that's caused this. It's just a convergence of all these different things that have created this system that we live in now.
And the politics of this, I think, is also really interesting. You talk about regressive and progressive democracy. Like, what do you mean by that? Like, what does that mean in this sort of context?
So I think one of the issues we have at the moment is we have political parties that don't really have a strong ideology anymore. What they're really looking to do is, how do I stay in power? And we're seeing at the moment that seems to be chasing reform voters. Things that doesn't work. We've seen plenty of kind of centrist parties across Europe trying to do that thing where they chase the kind of right-wing voters, but it only kind of reinforces the idea that the right and the far right are correct about what they believe, and that this party is abandoning kind of its principles. And therefore, we're seeing the results of this. Labour are doing terribly in the polls. Because they're not offering the real thing. They're offering a kind of simulation of that real thing, and people are aware of that or offended by that. So that's one of the problems that we have. I think what we need to do is, first of all, start with education. We need to understand that young people are distributors of information, and they are not trained to tell the difference between what's true and what's not on social media. It's not just about fact-checking headlines. They don't read newspapers anyway, so it's pointless. It's actually understanding how they operate in the spaces that they operate and empower them to actually do things. Not just say, whack our fingers at them and say, no, you can't believe this, you have to believe that. But how do you actually establish the truth? How do you build those skills? And that's about building critical thinking skills. We've seen actually recently a House of Lords report that says critical thinking skills, media literacy, is absolutely essential for our democracy. It has to be taught to young people. We also need to make sure that they can engage, I think, in a positive way with the democratic process. I mean, we talk about lowering the voting age, but it always comes back to me to this idea of positive and versus negative freedom. This is an idea that Isaiah Berlin comes up with. So negative freedom is the freedom from. It's like, freedom from interference, freedom of speech, all of that. We get an awful lot of that. The problem is we don't get positive freedom, which is actually the freedom to do things, to actually having influence in society. That's kind of been not so much taken away. In a way, we've given it away as a public because we think the political class will deal with problems and we'll just live our life. And the deal is that the political class will, keep the markets happy, make sure that we can all kind of move up in the world. But that hasn't really transpired. And the public kind of sense that, but I don't feel they know exactly what's happened. They feel like actually this promise that if I work hard, that meritocracy promises, I'll improve my standard of living, things will get better, hasn't really happened. Everyone's working harder and harder, and we're still stuck where we are, or even regressing into a more difficult situation. So in a way, that kind of deal we've had with the kind of technocratic politics that we live in now has collapsed. And we're kind of lost with nothing. And all political parties offer now, even reform, is a variation of that. Really, if you look at reform, they're offering more of the same. It's kind of the solution to the problems of neoliberalism is more neoliberalism. And that is not going to fix things. We need to have a much more radical approach of this. So it starts with education. Then we have to empower the citizenry. It's like, how do we actually get people involved with politics more directly? And there's various groups working on that. In the work of Bellingcat, for example, we're doing a lot of work around going into universities, teaching the people there how to deliver course material on open source investigation and actually apply that in real world cases, investigative hubs. And those hubs in the long term, we want to connect to local media, local NGOs, civil society actors to empower them to actually have an impact. But on the other side of that, institutions also need to respond to that. They can't just ignore that, because then that will make the problem more and more worse, as the kind of that transparency coming from the grassroots will reveal more and more about wrongdoing. And if nothing's done about that, then people will lose more and more trust in those institutions.
Here at Democracy for Sale, we're big supporters of freedom of information. We do a lot of work with FOI. We use it a lot. We advocate for it. We put on events around FOI. I was really interested. I saw a video, a talk you gave at Cambridge recently. You were talking about a project in Bradford with school children, and they were being actually taught how to use FOI to find out what the police were doing. And it does feel like part of this is actually helping people, actually making transparency tools that work, that people can use, helping people. A civic accountability side of this feels to be a real part of the package of things to try and help people to kind of understand what's happening.
Yeah, and I think as we live in a highly connected society where everyone plays a role in that verification process, they can also play a role in the deliberation and accountability processes as well. And that has to come from the grassroots up. But we need the spaces for that to happen. And if they're online spaces dominated by algorithm, you're drawn towards the worst version of yourself, effectively, in those terms. We need to have real world spaces where that can happen. We need ways for people to connect. I was at the Cambridge Disinformation Summit giving that speech, and I met people from lots of sectors, including the education sector. And they're really at the front line of a lot of this. But they were saying they rarely get to meet other people in this space who are actually working on these issues at kind of policy think tanks, NGOs, places like Bellingcat. And it gives them the opportunity to actually more deeply understand the issues, and also shape their response to this. Again, I think that House of Lords report on media literacy was very important. There's been other similar work like that. I'm working on a report for Demos at the moment. They've been doing this upgrading democracy work where they're looking at how people can be engaged. But we need to look at this not just in terms of what's happening in the UK, but across Europe and the US. I mean, for me, it's a pretty scary moment in the US because the opportunities to build those movements have to now come really from kind of outside of the government. But the government is hostile to those efforts and will go after them. You've seen what's happened with universities in the US. You're seeing, talks of NGOs being targeted in a similar way. So we need to be able to take action before we get to the point that the US is at the moment, because there's going to be a tipping point where it's become harder and harder to resist those kind of dark forces that really want to take democracy away from us. And they will do it under the guise of giving us more freedom. They say we're giving you as much freedom of speech as you want, but actually, it's not freedom to actually change things. It's not actual political power. It's just social power that, is great for a social media ecosystem that rewards engagement, but that's just rewarding the loudest, most obnoxious voices.
Well, it's interesting you say that as well. Well, it's that Reforms conference they've recently brought in, because it was a private limited company owned by Nigel Farage, which is how he was able to come back as the leader. He was able to get rid of Richard Tice because he owned the company. And they've now they've changed the structure so it's not for profit. And there's a board, but the board basically got very little power. And it was internal motion. So they had a kind of internal, like you would get at a party conference. I felt like a simulacrum of a party conference. Farage wasn't there. They had three motions, one on net zero, ditch net zero, one on transgender, basically ditch transgender rights, and another motion. And how they worked, it was just a former TV presenter, David Bull, who's the would-be chairman, on a stage like in a game show, and people got to put up their hand if they disagreed. And unsurprisingly, the people who put up their hands said every motion didn't go far enough. There wasn't a single person who put up their hands and said, maybe I don't. And it felt like a simulacrum of what you might see at a party conference. And I thought that was really interesting, using a kind of managed democracy we see in places like Viktor Orban's Hungary and actually in Putin's Russia as well, like using the language and the trappings of democracy, but doing things that really, like, they don't fit within a genuine space of deliberation. They fit more like a kind of a game show, really, where you press a button and register your vote.
Well, I mean, this is exactly kind of that deliberation process becoming simulated, that it's about reinforcing the groupthink. It's about loyalty tests. If someone put their hand up and said, I disagree with all of this, then they would have been kind of pushed to the side and said, you're not really one of us. And this is the thing, when it starts becoming about in-group versus out-group logic, and that the loyalty to the in-group is absolute, that's no longer about democracy. That's a form of authoritarianism. And this is really what reform is organizing itself around, the simulation of a functional democracy. And it's no surprise that at the event you saw exactly this happening, because this is what they're about. Even though they may not even understand it in those terms, I'm sure they're all thinking they're all about freedom of speech and democracy. Really what they're offering is kind of this negative freedom. But when you actually want positive freedom, the freedom to change things, they're going to say, oh, well, you're oppressing our opinions. You're you're the enemy. You're the outgroup. You're oppressing us. We are the victims here. And it's that kind of logic that we've seen with the MAGA movement. We're seeing it with reform. We've seen this with other movements across Europe.
I kind of wanted just to talk a bit about Bellingcat as well, actually, because you're talking about, Bellingcat is a media organization, and what we've seen as well is like kind of is a sense in which, if you look across the piece, the rise of right-wing populism in different countries, if you look at say the States, Donald Trump now doesn't even use X. He's got Truth Social, which he owns, so he's making money out of it, but also a huge media ecosystem, which most of which did not exist 10 years ago, that's feeding, say, on the right. In Hungary, you've almost no independent media left at all. It's almost all gone. It's all Orbanite media. As I say, in the UK, you're starting to see, you've got the Telegraph and Express are now kind of house journals of reform. You've got GB News, but a lot of new media, which in some ways, is to be celebrated. Bellingcat's new media, Democracy Sales and new media. But it feels as if what's kind of happening at the same time is kind of attacks on civil society organizations. And I kind of wanted to kind of get your sense, how does somewhere like Bellingcat, how does an independent media outlet sit within all of that? How, what led you from, say, starting Bellingcat to ending up in a place where you're looking at things like disordered discourse and trying to understand them?
I mean, for me, it's kind of not just understanding, this idea of where's all this disinformation coming from, but what is Bellingcat's place within this system? We live in a very complicated information ecosystem. We have the kind of traditional institutional media, which is struggling with the changes. It's adapting in ways that often are actually quite toxic towards kind of that idea of them being the verifiers of information, especially the more tabloidy media that's chasing engagement online. But you're also seeing a lot more independent media. And for me, it's about how do you develop kind of that network of independent media, NGOs, civil society actors who can come together and work together. I think in the kind of more traditional models, you separate the media from everyone else. And I think for me, that's something that is going to fail in that current system, because we exist in a very heavily networked society. We exist in a society where people can see how exactly the information they want and what they need on various topics. And there are people who really do want to find the truth. Really, the people who are engaged with disordered discourse believe they're also finding the truth. It's just they're doing it through a kind of warped lens of reality. So how do we stop them reaching that point? How do you reach audiences? For us, most recently, it's about thinking, we are known for our work on Russia, our work on Syria, and we actually do a lot of work on different topics. But the difficulty is building an audience in such a splintered information ecosystem where reaching an audience means kind of breaking through a bubble in many cases, even if the audiences are kind of involved in more kind of functional discourse. What we're trying to do is look for, new media channels, say YouTube channels, TikTokers, whoever it may be, who are already producing the kind of content on the subjects we're writing about and working with them as partners. We did a video recently, for example, with an organization called Search Party. They do YouTube videos, a lot of which are on sports-related investigative journalism. And we had written this piece on OneXBet, who are running basically thousands of sports games a day that you can bet on, but it's stuff like five-a-side football, like just completely ridiculous sports. And it's the same people playing the same matches under different team names. And they did a long video on it. It got 1 million views, which is more than we could have expected on the website. And that's just a good way to partner. In terms of ice raids, for example, we work with a organization called Evident who does video-based productions, and then we team up with local media in each state. So recently we've done one with Cal Matters in California, looking at ice raids. So it's about having those networks, working on investigations and saying, who is a good partner for this? Who has an audience? Who is interested in this subject that we can kind of reach out to and collaborate with on these investigations? And because the work we do is open source and that we can show our working and, when we're in these collaborations, share information, it means that we can be transparent with both the audience and the participants, the partners in those investigations, which is very helpful. But it really is about building that network, not just seeing yourself as just one organization in competition with a bunch of similar organizations.
And it's fair to say Bellingcat has been itself the focus of quite a lot of disordered discourse over the years. Been accused of being CIA agents, of pretty much everything, and you have too. What's that been like? What's it been like for an organization? What's it been like for you? What kind of things have you had to endure?
Oh God, well, I think another reason this whole process has helped me is kind of understanding where that comes from. It's mainly less judgmental of those people. I'm still annoyed with them, but I kind of understand where that's coming from. At first, years ago, it bothered me, but now it doesn't really bother me that much because in a way it helps us identify the people who are not worth bothering with to a certain extent. Because once you're that deep into a kind of disordered information ecosystem that you believe Bellingcat is the CIA or Zionists or whatever we're called, from one day to the next, then whatever we say to correct that isn't going to help them because they're already surrounded by people saying, yes, you're right. Here's information to support what you already believe. But it's kind of valuable to recognize that. I mean, we've been targeted by state level actors, but we've also been kind of targeted by kind of more of these grassroots actors who really do genuinely believe that we're the CIA or something like that. Both are can be scary in their own way. You can have a GRU officer turning up at an event or someone with a YouTube channel turning out an event, and they're both obnoxious in their own way. But a lot of it is really about, being aware of the security issues related to that, making sure the staff's informed and trained, but also learning not to, in a way, take it too personally because they are really participants in systems they don't understand that kind of warps their view of reality.
Yeah, and I guess what's interesting as well, I think, is watching something like Bellingcat where you I love the videos you guys sometimes do where you show your workings. I think they're probably my favorite things to go. This is how we did the story. We went and did this. And it's a real range of methodological tools, and there's actually great resources on your website for how to do some of this what we call open source intelligence work. But I guess my sense is that there's definitely a constituency that no matter how much, even if they came into the office and sat next to you all day for a week, it wouldn't really change their perception. I think I guess it's almost in a way kind of speaking to the people who aren't there, who haven't got to that place in terms of perception to kind of go, right, here's actually what's going on.
Yeah. And one thing that's useful about transparency, it's not just about saying, here's our evidence. It's about also saying, here's how we work. And that people can see that and be inspired by that. I think for me, one of the big moments in terms of the use of open source investigation was the invasion of Ukraine, or the official invasion of Ukraine in 2022, because a lot of media organizations had learned from us directly in many cases how to do open source investigation. So they were actually doing investigations the way we were doing it. We also had communities that had formed around us who were ordinary people, but had also learned those skills and formed these communities that when disinformation was being published, they were debunking it sometimes within an hour, which stopped it reaching those disordered ecosystems that, spread so many conspiracy theories. So for me, that was a really big moment because it showed that we both had the kind of traditional institutions involved, but also the more grassroots movements getting involved with this. And for me, it really is about spreading these ideas and techniques as widely as possible, because I think for democracy, they're very, very empowering. It's very much about, and I actually realized as I was doing this work and building this model of verification, deliberation, and accountability in counterpublics, that Bellingcat is actually a counterpublic that when I set this up, it was because I had a certain degree of frustration to how the conflicts in Libya and Syria was being covered, because there's all this online information that was being ignored. So I developed a process of verifying that information to help aid the deliberation around the conflicts. And that has led to real accountability in those conflicts as well. So I kind of realized I'd almost accidentally done the thing I was writing about in that moment.
One of the challenges, I guess, for people who are trying to do independent, fact-based journalism in the United Kingdom is being sued, is legal threats. It's something I've written a lot about. I've had a lot of experience of, and you have too. And I guess I just wanted to briefly, ask you about that, particularly the case of Evgeny Prigozhin. The head of the Wagner Group sued you in London, and it's one of the most, I think, incredible stories I've seen of how. Independent, verified journalism can attempt to be silenced by people who are very wealthy.
Yeah, I mean, that case, I think, is particularly bad because, first of all, it wasn't because of something I'd actually written. I had posted 4 tweets, 2 posted to an article that was by CNN and Spiegel, and 2 to a Bellingcat article. And in those articles, it said Prigozhin was linked with the mercenary corps of Wagner. And Wagner were bad guys. So
and just for clarity as well, at the time he was under sanctions by the British government.
By the British government, EU and US governments for his relationship with them. Despite that being the case, and despite half those articles not even being written by me, I was then targeted by his lawyers and sued for saying these things. I was very fortunate unfortunately, in a way, that the invasion of Ukraine happened. The lawyers pulled out of the case. It seemed to be related to that. And then Prigozhin failed to fill in the correct form at the court to actually continue the case. It was almost luck on my part. But that could have cost, over £1 million to actually fight that case, which was completely ridiculous. Even getting to court cost us close to £70,000 or £80,000. And that wasn't even before the case started, because it costs a huge amount just to prepare the groundwork to be ready to be actually in court arguing the case, even though it was a completely absurd case. That the idea that I had damaged his reputation when he was under sanctions for that very thing by, the EU, US and UK was insane. Yeah. What the case collapsed, we complained to the Solicitors Regulation Authority, and they were basically like, oh yeah, that's fine. That can happen. That basically means anyone can be sued for anything, in my mind. If you've got a lot of money and you want to go after a journalist and cause them problems and you don't care about losing, then you can go after them and cause them a huge amount of financial damage that, if you're an independent journalist especially, you're not going to be able to fight those cases, and you will lose a lot of money.
And I guess it's something that the Labour government has said they were going to act on, they were going to do something about, and we're now well over a year and nothing has happened so far. At least from where I'm sitting, this is an issue that urgently needs action and reform.
And the sad thing is they're too busy chasing after migrants to kind of really do anything serious. They're chasing those reform voters who are never going to vote for them anyway, and upsetting the voters that they already have, when, they could be pursuing these actual substantial policies, not just on this. I mean, I obviously have my own, involvement in it, but on a whole range of different topics. And I think it's really, really unfortunate that they seem to be chasing whatever's trending on Twitter rather than, actual serious policies.
And I guess, Eliot, just that brings us kind of nicely, I think, to a close, which is, how optimistic are you, or even pessimistic are you, about the kind of future of democracy, of a vibrant democracy in this kind of age of information disorder?
Well, I'm a kind of optimistic pessimist, I would say. I mean, I definitely recognize there's a huge number of problems and challenges, but I also see there are lots of organizations who are really working towards solving those problems. The challenge is, can we do it quickly enough to meet the scale of the issue? Can we have those institutions that do need to be involved, even if we may not like them too much, actually being involved and actually being part of this? Because we can't just do this from the bottom up and hope the top notices. We need everyone involved with this. We need it across society. In my work, I'm trying to kind of map out how different elements of society, kind of different tracks of activity, can actually work together, rather than us all being in our own silos and working on the same issues and not talking to each other. So there is a certain degree of positivity there, but it needs people to realize what's going on and not point fingers towards Russia being the problem or point fingers towards reform, but actually understand, this is something we all are involved with and that we all need to work on.
Eliot, thank you so much for this. It's been really, really interesting and an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks for having me on.